The desperate hostage plan. The harsh winds of the alien desert howled around Commander Ethan Carter as he crouched behind a jagged rock. His breathing was shallow, his muscles tense. The night sky above was an endless sea of stars, but Ethan had no time to admire the view. He was deep in enemy territory, and every moment spent here could be his last. Ethan's mission was simple, or so he thought. He had come to this hostile planet to rescue his crew, who had been taken captive by General Konnek, the ruthless leader of the Krellic Empire. Konnek was infamous across the galaxy for his cruelty and his thirst for domination. Ethan had heard the stories, but seeing the general's stronghold with his own eyes was something else entirely. The massive fortress loomed in the distance, glowing with eerie green lights. It was surrounded by high walls, guarded by alien soldiers with sharp claws and glowing eyes. Getting inside undetected had been nearly impossible, but Ethan was nothing if not determined. His crew was counting on him, and he wasn't about to let them down. Slipping through the shadows, Ethan made his way into the heart of the fortress. His heart pounded in his chest as he crept past alien guards, his pulse quickening every time one of them turned their head. He relied on his training, staying silent and invisible, until he reached a large chamber at the center of the compound. But what he found there was not what he had expected. Instead of his crew, the room held a single occupant, a tall, graceful alien woman with silver skin and glowing blue eyes. She was bound by energy restraints, her expression calm but defiant. She didn't look like a prisoner in the traditional sense. Her clothes were elegant, and there was a strange aura of authority about her. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. Who was she? And why was she being held here? Before he could figure out his next move, alarms blared throughout the fortress. His heart sank. He had been spotted. The woman's eyes snapped to him, sharp and calculating. "If you want to live," she said in a cool, melodic voice, "you'll take me with you." Ethan didn't have time to argue. He rushed forward and disabled the energy restraints, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the exit. "Who are you?" he demanded as they ran. "I'm your only chance at survival," she replied cryptically. Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency in her step. The fortress erupted into chaos. Alien soldiers swarmed the hallways, shouting orders in their guttural language. Ethan and the woman barely managed to stay ahead of them, using every bit of cover they could find. Ethan's pulse raced as he exchanged fire with the guards, his blaster bolts lighting up the dim corridors. "Keep moving," he shouted, his grip on her arm tightening. She followed without complaint, her long legs keeping pace with him. They burst out of the fortress and into the open desert. Ethan's small ship was parked a short distance away, hidden behind a rocky outcrop. But the alien guards were right behind them, their weapons firing bright green energy blasts that scorched the ground around them. "Get in," Ethan barked as they reached the ship. The woman climbed aboard without hesitation, and Ethan followed, slamming the hatch shut behind him. He raced to the cockpit and fired up the engines. The ship roared to life, and they shot into the sky just as the alien soldiers reached their position. For a moment, Ethan allowed himself to breathe. They had escaped, for now. But his relief was short-lived. The woman stood behind him, her piercing blue eyes fixed on him. There was something unsettling about her gaze, something that made Ethan feel like he was in over his head. "Who are you?" he asked again, his voice firm. "And why were you being held there?" "My name is Lyra," she said simply. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Ethan frowned. What's that supposed to mean? Lyra's lips curled into a faint, enigmatic smile. "You don't know who I am, do you? You don't know what you've just done." Before Ethan could respond, his ship's sensors lit up with warnings. A massive vessel was approaching them at high speed. It was Konnek's flagship, and it was gaining on them fast. "They're not going to let us go," Lyra said, her voice calm despite the danger. "Not with me on board." Ethan's grip on the controls tightened. He had no idea what he had gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. This mission had just become far more complicated than he had anticipated. As Kanek's ship loomed closer, Ethan prepared for the fight of his life. Little did he know, the real battle had only just begun. Escape through the unknown. The desert stretched endlessly beneath the orange haze of twin suns. Ethan's ship was hurtling through the atmosphere, its engines screaming under the strain of evading General Kanek's warship. Alarms blared in the cockpit, and warning lights flashed red. Ethan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the controls, jerking the ship into a sharp dive to avoid another barrage of green plasma fire. "Do you ever slow down?" Lyra asked, her tone cool despite the chaos. She was strapped into the co-pilot's seat, her silver skin glinting faintly in the light. Her calm demeanor unnerved Ethan, especially considering they were seconds away from being blasted out of the sky. "Maybe if we weren't being chased by an entire alien fleet, I'd take a break," Ethan snapped, glancing at the scanner. "And who the hell are you to be so important?" "Kanek's throwing everything he's got at us." Lyra tilted her head, her glowing blue eyes meeting his. "You're the one who freed me without asking questions. Maybe the better question is, why did you think you could take me without consequences?" Ethan scowled but didn't answer. He didn't like how she turned the tables on him so easily. He banked the ship hard to the right, narrowly avoiding a plasma bolt that scorched the wing. He knew they wouldn't last long in the open skies. "There's a canyon system up ahead," Lyra said suddenly, her voice carrying an edge of urgency. "You can lose them there." "How do you know that?" Ethan demanded, suspicious. She leaned forward, pointing at the scanner. "Because I've been on this planet a lot longer than you, human. Trust me, or we both die." Ethan gritted his teeth but followed her advice, steering the ship toward the jagged maze of canyons below. The rocky formations were massive, rising like monoliths from the desert floor. He dove into the narrow passages, weaving through sharp turns and tight spaces. The warship hesitated to follow, its size making it vulnerable in the cramped terrain. For a moment, it seemed like they'd lost their pursuers. The silence in the cockpit was broken only by the hum of the ship's engines. Ethan took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. Lyra unbuckled her harness and stood, brushing imaginary dust off her elegant robes. "You're lucky they're not as skilled as you are, but luck doesn't last forever." Ethan spun his chair to face her. "Enough with the cryptic talk. I need answers. Who are you? Why is Kanek so desperate to get you back?" Lyra crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "My name is Lyra Kanek. Yes, I'm his daughter. But I'm more than that. I'm the key to his plans that would spell disaster for your entire species." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of plans?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the viewport. "Kanek isn't just a warlord. He's a geneticist. He's been experimenting with creating hybrid soldiers, combining the best traits of humans and Krillak to make the perfect warriors. I am the prototype." The weight of her words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. "Wait, you're saying he's using your DNA to make super soldiers?" Lyra nodded. "And now that you've taken me, he's lost his most valuable asset. He won't stop until he gets me back." Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to process what he'd just heard. The stakes were far higher than he'd realized. He hadn't just angered a powerful alien general. He'd disrupted a plan that could threaten the entire galaxy. Before he could ask more questions, the ship's warning alarms blared again. Ethan glanced at the scanner and cursed. A squadron of smaller fighter ships had entered the canyon, weaving through the rocks in pursuit. "They're sending in scouts," he muttered, pulling the ship into a steep climb to gain altitude. "We can't outrun them forever." Lyra stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Then we need to disappear." Ethan shot her a skeptical look. "Disappearing isn't exactly an option right now." "There's an abandoned human outpost not far from here," she said. "If we can reach it, we can hide long enough to come up with a plan." "How do you know about a human outpost?" Ethan asked, his suspicion growing. Lyra gave him a faint smile. I told you, I've been on this planet longer than you. Let's just say I've been studying your people. Ethan didn't like how she avoided the question, but he didn't have time to argue. The fighters were closing in, and their plasma cannons were tearing through the canyon walls. He pushed the ship to its limits, following Lyra's directions until the scanners picked up the faint outline of a structure hidden among the rocks. The outpost was in ruins, its walls covered in rust and sand, but it had a landing pad, and Ethan brought the ship down hard, skidding to a stop just as the fighters appeared on the horizon. "Get inside," he ordered, grabbing his blaster and leaping out of the cockpit. Lyra followed, her movements graceful despite the urgency. As they sprinted into the outpost, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn deeper into a game he didn't understand. And the enigmatic Lyra, with her cryptic words and mysterious knowledge, was at the center of it all. Little did he know, the real danger was yet to come, an uneasy alliance. The silence inside the abandoned outpost was thick, broken only by the faint hum of dormant machinery and the occasional creak of settling metal. Ethan held his blaster tightly, his eyes scanning the shadowy corridors for any sign of movement. Lyra followed a step behind, her glowing blue eyes alert, her expression unreadable. The outpost was a relic of humanity's first ventures into this corner of the galaxy. It had been abandoned for decades, the walls rusted and the air stale. To Ethan, it felt more like a tomb than a refuge. But for now, it was the only place to hide from Kanek's relentless pursuit. "We don't have much time," Lyra said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency. "Those fighters won't stay out there forever. They'll figure out where we landed." Ethan turned to her, his brow furrowed. "You're awfully calm for someone being hunted by their own people. Care to explain why?" Lyra tilted her head, her silver skin catching the dim light. "I've been hunted my whole life, Commander. Calm is the only thing that keeps you alive." Ethan scowled but didn't argue. He motioned for her to follow as he moved deeper into the outpost, searching for anything useful. The control room was their best bet, a central hub where he might find power or communications equipment to contact his ship's crew, or at least figure out their next move. When they reached the room, Ethan sighed in relief. It was mostly intact. Dust covered the consoles, and the screens were dark, but the systems appeared to be operational. He set his blaster on a console and began tapping at the controls, trying to boot up the power grid. Lyra stood near the doorway, watching him with a faint smirk. "You're quite resourceful. I suppose that's why you've survived this long." Ethan didn't look up. "Spare me the compliments. If you want to be helpful, keep an eye on the door." Lyra chuckled softly but complied, her glowing eyes scanning the hallway. "You don't trust me," she said after a moment, her tone almost playful. "Should I?" Ethan asked, not pausing in his work. "You're Kanek's daughter. For all I know, this is some elaborate trap, and you're leading me right to him." Her smirk faded. "If I wanted you dead, you wouldn't have made it out of the fortress." That shut him up. Ethan focused on the console, finally coaxing the power grid to life. Lights flickered on, dim but steady, and the air filled with a low hum as the systems came online. He accessed the scanners, hoping to track the fighters outside. What he saw made his stomach sink. "They're regrouping," he muttered. "It won't be long before they find us." Lyra stepped closer, her expression serious now. "Then we need to prepare." "Prepare for what?" Ethan asked, turning to face her. "We're outnumbered, outgunned, and stuck in a tin can in the middle of nowhere." Lyra held his gaze, her voice steady. "You forget who I am. I know their tactics. I know their weaknesses. If you trust me, just for a little while, I can help you survive." Ethan studied her for a moment, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. But what choice did he have? He sighed and nodded. "Fine, but if you try anything—" "You'll shoot me," she finished, her smirk returning. "I've heard it before." She moved past him to the console, her fingers gliding over the controls with practiced ease. Within moments, she had accessed the outpost's defense systems. Rusted turrets hummed to life, their barrels swiveling into position. "This should buy us some time," she said, "but it won't stop them. Not completely." Ethan folded his arms. "And what's your grand plan after that?" Lyra hesitated, her expression softening. "There's something I haven't told you. Something important." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "This ought to be good." She met his gaze, her glowing eyes filled with a strange mix of determination and vulnerability. "I'm not just a prototype for KNX hybrid soldiers. I'm connected to them. I can feel their presence, their thoughts. If I concentrate, I might be able to disrupt their communications, confuse them long enough for us to escape." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're telling me you have some kind of mental link to them?" Lyra nodded. "It's part of the experiment. KNX wanted his soldiers to operate as a single unified force. But that link goes both ways. If I focus, I can use it against them." Ethan shook his head, struggling to process what she was saying. "And why didn't you mention this before?" "Because it's dangerous," she admitted. "If I push too hard, they'll know exactly where I am. And if KNX gets a hold of me..." She trailed off, her expression dark. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling to the surface. "Great. So we either sit here and wait to die, or we gamble on your telepathic abilities." Lyra smiled faintly. "When you put it that way, it doesn't sound so bad." Before Ethan could respond, the outpost shook violently, a deafening explosion echoing through the walls. The fighters had found them, and the first wave of attacks had begun. "Looks like we're out of time," Lyra said, her voice calm but firm. "Are you ready to trust me?" Ethan grabbed his blaster, his jaw set. "Do I have a choice?" As the walls trembled and alarms blared, Ethan and Lyra prepared for the fight of their lives. Neither of them knew if they would survive, but one thing was certain. Their uneasy alliance was their only hope. The alien boss's true intentions. The abandoned outpost shuddered under the relentless assault. Plasma bolts rained down on its rusted walls, sending showers of sparks cascading into the dimly lit control room. Ethan crouched behind a console, his blaster ready. Lyra stood near the central monitor, her glowing blue eyes darting across the tactical display. Despite the chaos, she remained eerily calm. "They're testing the defenses," Lyra said, her voice steady. "KNX always sends a first wave to flush out his prey." Ethan scowled, his grip tightening on his weapon. "And the second wave?" Lyra's expression darkened. "He doesn't send a second wave. He comes himself." Ethan cursed under his breath. KNX wasn't just a ruthless warlord. He was a strategist who enjoyed crushing his enemies personally. Ethan had heard stories of the alien general's brutality, whole colonies wiped out in the name of progress. Now he was the one being hunted, and the stakes were higher than he'd ever imagined. The control room trembled again as another explosion rocked the outpost. Ethan glanced at the monitor, watching as the turrets outside returned fire, their automated targeting systems barely keeping the fighters at bay. "This isn't going to hold," Ethan muttered. "We need a plan." Lyra's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. "I told you. I can disrupt their communications, but it'll only buy us time. If we're going to escape, we need to know where to go." Ethan's frustration boiled over. "And how do you suggest we do that? We're stuck on a dead planet with no backup and no resources." Lyra hesitated, then moved to a secondary console. Her fingers danced across the controls, and the screen flickered to life, displaying a series of alien schematics. Ethan recognized the design immediately. It was KNX's flagship. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Giving us an edge," Lyra replied. "This outpost's database contains old Krillak files, stolen intel from a failed human mission years ago. It's incomplete, but it might give us a way to disable KNX's ship." Ethan's skepticism was palpable. "And you're just now telling me this?" Lyra shot him a sharp look. "Do you want to argue, or do you want to survive?" Ethan bit back a retort and focused on the screen. The schematics showed the ship's internal structure, including its power core. If they could disable that, they might have a chance to escape unnoticed. As Ethan studied the display, a thought nagged at the back of his mind. Why would Kanek risk chasing us himself? You said you're important, but this feels personal. Lyra's shoulders stiffened, and she avoided his gaze. It is personal, she admitted quietly. I'm not just his daughter. I'm his weapon. Ethan frowned. What are you talking about? Lyra took a deep breath, her voice steady but laced with bitterness. Kanek didn't create me out of love or loyalty. I was engineered to be the perfect hybrid, a bridge between humans and Krillak. My DNA is the blueprint for an army of hybrids he plans to use to conquer Earth, but I refuse to be his pawn. That's why he's hunting me. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're saying he's trying to mass-produce soldiers using your DNA? Lyra nodded. And it's worse than that. His experiments weren't just about physical superiority. He wanted to create hybrids with psychic connections, a hive mind he could control. That's why he's so desperate to get me back. Without me, his plans fall apart. Ethan's mind reeled. He had known Kanek was dangerous, but this was on another level. If the alien general succeeded, humanity wouldn't just lose the war, they'd lose their freedom. So what's the plan? Ethan asked, forcing himself to focus. We can't take on Kanek's entire fleet. Lyra's gaze hardened. We don't need to. If we can board his flagship and destroy the central cloning chamber, it'll cripple his operation. He won't be able to replicate the hybrids without me. Ethan laughed bitterly. That's your plan? Sneak onto the most heavily guarded ship in the galaxy and blow up its core. Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? Lyra's lips curled into a faint smile. Insanity is what humans do best, isn't it? Before Ethan could respond, the monitor beeped, drawing their attention. The fighters outside were retreating, pulling back in perfect formation. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end. He's here, Lyra said softly. As if on cue, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the outpost's comm system. It was Kanek, his tone cold and commanding. Ethan Carter. Surrender now, and I will make your death quick. Resist, and you will watch as I dismantle your kind piece by piece. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced at Lyra, who met his gaze with unwavering resolve. It's your call, Commander, she said. Do we fight or run? Ethan gritted his teeth. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. Kanek wasn't just an enemy. He was a threat to everything Ethan stood for. And if Lyra was right, she was their only hope of stopping him. We fight, Ethan said, his voice firm. But we do it on our terms. Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. Together, they began to prepare, knowing full well that the battle ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Outside, Kanek's warship descended, its shadow engulfing the outpost as the final confrontation loomed. The shocking revelation. The ground trembled as Kanek's warship settled just beyond the outpost, its massive bulk casting an ominous shadow over the rusted ruins. Inside the control room, Ethan and Lyra worked in tense silence. The air was thick with unspoken urgency, every second a countdown to inevitable confrontation. Ethan crouched by a console, rigging together a makeshift explosive from the outpost's limited supplies. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his mind raced with doubts. This plan wasn't just reckless, it was suicidal. Yet, with Kanek's forces closing in, there was no alternative. Are you sure about this? Ethan asked, not looking up. Lyra stood nearby, her glowing blue eyes fixed on the holographic map of the outpost. Her silver skin shimmered faintly in the dim light, making her seem almost ethereal. If we don't act now, we won't get another chance, she replied. Kanek won't risk losing me again. He'll destroy this place and take my remains if he has to. Ethan paused, glancing at her. You say that like it doesn't bother you. Lyra met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I've made my peace with what I am. Ethan frowned but said nothing. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding something back, something important. But before he could press her, the outpost's sensors lit up, signaling incoming hostiles. They're here, Lyra said softly. Ethan grabbed his blaster and turned to her. Stick to the plan. I'll hold them off while you work your psychic. Whatever. Lyra gave him a faint smile. It's more complicated than that, but I'll do my part. Just try not to get yourself killed. Ethan snorted. No promises. He moved to the entrance, taking cover behind a broken piece of metal as the first wave of Kanek's soldiers approached. The Krylak warriors were formidable, tall, with sharp claws and armor that glinted in the sunlight. Ethan took a deep breath and opened fire, his blaster bolts lighting up the battlefield. The fight was brutal. Ethan was outnumbered, and every shot he fired felt like delaying the inevitable. But he couldn't afford to retreat. Every second he bought was another second for Lyra to execute her plan. Inside the control room, Lyra closed her eyes and focused. The link to Kanek's forces was always there, a constant hum in the back of her mind. She had spent years learning to block it out, to maintain her independence. But now she had to embrace it. She reached out mentally, feeling the threads of connection that bound the Krylak soldiers to their leader. The moment she tapped into the link, a surge of pain shot through her skull. She gasped, her knees buckling, but she forced herself to stay upright. Through the haze of agony, she could sense their thoughts, cold, precise, and utterly loyal to Kanek. She focused harder, sending waves of confusion and disarray through the link, hoping to disrupt their coordination. Outside, Ethan noticed the change immediately. The Krylak warriors hesitated, their movements faltering. He took advantage of the opening, picking off several of them with well-placed shots. But the reprieve was short-lived. A low rumble echoed across the battlefield, and Ethan turned to see Kanek himself stepping out of the warship. The alien general was an imposing figure, towering over his soldiers. His black armor gleamed, and his glowing red eyes radiated menace. He carried a massive energy blade, its edge crackling with deadly energy. Ethan Carter, Kanek said, his voice deep and resonant. You have interfered in matters beyond your comprehension. Surrender Lyra now, and I may let you live. Ethan tightened his grip on his blaster. You're not getting her back. Kanek tilted his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. You think you can protect her? She belongs to me, human. She was created for a purpose you cannot fathom. Before Ethan could respond, Lyra's voice came through his earpiece. Ethan, you need to get out of there. Now. I'm not leaving you, he replied, firing at Kanek. The alien general deflected the shot effortlessly with his blade, advancing with slow, deliberate steps. Lyra's voice was strained. It's not about me. There's something I didn't tell you. Ethan ducked behind cover, his heart pounding. What are you talking about? There was a pause, and then Lyra said the words that would change everything. I'm pregnant. Ethan froze. For a moment, the battle around him seemed to fade into the background. What? He whispered, his voice barely audible. It's complicated, Lyra said, her tone laced with guilt. Kanek's experiments weren't just about creating hybrids. They were about reproduction. The process was triggered when I came into contact with human DNA. Ethan's mind raced. You're saying the child is mine? Yes, Lyra admitted, and that's why we can't let him capture me. If he gets a hold of this child, he'll use it to perfect his hybrids. Earth won't stand a chance. Ethan's grip on his blaster tightened. The stakes had just become unimaginably higher. He couldn't afford to lose. Not now. Kanek closed the distance, his blade raised. You cannot win, human. Surrender, and I will make your death painless. Ethan stepped out of cover, his blaster aimed at the alien general. Over my dead body. Kanek smirked. That can be arranged. As the two prepared to face off, Lyra pushed her powers to the limit. sending a shockwave through the psychic link. The Krillek soldiers collapsed, their minds overwhelmed by the disruption. But the effort took a toll on her, and she fell to her knees, gasping for breath. Ethan didn't hesitate. With Kanek momentarily distracted by the chaos, he fired a concentrated blast at the general's blade, shattering it. Kanek roared in fury, but Ethan didn't wait to see what would happen next. He sprinted back to the control room, scooping up Lyra and carrying her toward the ship. "Hang on," he said as he strapped her into the co-pilot's seat. "We're getting out of here." As the ship lifted off, Kanek's warship began to stir, its weapons locking onto them. Ethan pushed the engines to their limit, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. This wasn't just a mission anymore, it was personal, and he would do whatever it took to protect Lyra and the child she carried. The final stand. The stars stretched endlessly across the void as Ethan's ship rocketed away from the planet's surface. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, her silver skin glistening under the dim glow of the cockpit lights. Her breathing was labored, her energy drained after the psychic assault she had unleashed on Kanek's forces. Ethan glanced at her, concern etched across his face. "You hanging in there?" he asked, adjusting the ship's trajectory. Lyra nodded weakly. "I'll manage. But Kanek won't stop. He'll follow us." Ethan tapped at the console, pulling up a tactical map. Kanek's warship was already in pursuit, a massive blip closing in fast. Ethan's small transport didn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation, but he wasn't planning on fighting fair. "We'll have to make a stand," Ethan said, his voice grim. "We can't outrun them, and hiding won't work twice. But if we can lure him into a trap." Lyra turned her glowing blue eyes toward him. "A trap? With what resources?" Ethan's lips curled into a faint smile. "We still have the schematics for his flagship. If we can get aboard, we can overload the ship's core. It'll take out him and his entire fleet." Lyra's expression tightened. "You're talking about a suicide mission." Ethan shrugged. "I don't see another option, unless you've got a better idea." Lyra hesitated, then shook her head. "No, but if we do this, we'll have to act fast. Kanek won't give us the luxury of time." Ethan keyed in a course correction, steering the ship toward a nearby asteroid field. The dense field of rocks would provide cover and force Kanek's ship to slow down. More importantly, it would give them the element of surprise. As the ship entered the asteroid field, Ethan activated the cloaking system, hiding their presence. The sensors showed Kanek's warship entering the field moments later, its size making it a lumbering target among the tumbling rocks. "This is it," Ethan said, strapping on his gear. He handed Lyra a small energy blade. "If we're going to do this, we do it together." Lyra took the blade, her grip steady despite her exhaustion. "Let's end this." The two boarded an escape pod rigged with a stealth drive, launching toward Kanek's flagship. The journey was tense, every second filled with the knowledge that one misstep would mean their deaths. As they approached the massive ship, Ethan marveled at its scale. The vessel was a fortress, bristling with weapons and swarming with patrol ships. Lyra guided them to a maintenance hatch on the ship's underside. Using her knowledge of Krillek systems, she bypassed the security protocols, and the hatch opened with a hiss. They climbed inside, moving quickly through the dark industrial corridors. "This way," Lyra whispered, leading them toward the power core. "The main reactor is in the central chamber. If we can destabilize it, the resulting explosion will take out the entire ship." Ethan followed, his blaster at the ready. The corridors were eerily quiet, the hum of the ship's systems the only sound. But the silence didn't last. As they approached the core, alarms blared, and the walls lit up with flashing red lights. "They know we're here," Ethan said, his voice tense. Lyra nodded. "Keep moving. We're close." A squad of Krillek soldiers appeared, blocking their path. Ethan didn't hesitate, firing off precise shots that dropped two of them instantly. Lyra activated her energy blade, her movements swift and fluid, as she dispatched another soldier. Together, they pushed forward, their determination outweighing their fear. The core chamber was massive, a cavernous room dominated by a pulsing sphere of energy suspended in the center. The sphere emitted a low, ominous hum, its glow bathing the room in an eerie light. "We need to plant the charges near the stabilizers," Lyra said, pointing to the massive pylons surrounding the core. Ethan nodded, setting to work. As he armed the explosives, Lyra stood guard, her senses on high alert. The tension in the air was palpable, every second stretching into an eternity. Just as Ethan finished arming the last charge, the chamber doors slammed open, and Kanek strode in. His presence was overwhelming, his towering figure radiating power. He held a new energy blade, its edge glowing with a menacing red light. "Ethan Carter," Kanek said, his voice a low growl. "Did you really think you could challenge me and live?" Ethan stood, his blaster aimed at the general. "I didn't come here to live. I came here to end you." Kanek smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You are nothing but an insect clinging to the hope of defiance. And you," he turned his gaze to Lyra, "you disappoint me. You were meant to lead our people into a new era. Instead, you side with this human." Lyra stepped forward, her energy blade igniting. "I choose my own path, and it doesn't involve being your pawn." Kanek roared, lunging at them with terrifying speed. The chamber erupted into chaos as Ethan and Lyra fought the alien general. Kanek was relentless, his strikes powerful and precise. But Ethan and Lyra fought with equal determination, their movements synchronized as they worked together to hold him off. As the battle raged, the core began to destabilize, the charges ticking down toward detonation. The room shook violently, sparks flying as the ship's systems overloaded. "We have to go," Lyra shouted, blocking the strike from Kanek's blade. Ethan nodded, firing a shot that forced the general to retreat. "Get to the pod. I'll hold him off." "No," Lyra said firmly. "We finish this together." Kanek roared in fury, charging at them with renewed vigor. But Lyra's psychic powers surged, and she sent a shockwave through the chamber, knocking the general off balance. Ethan seized the moment, firing a blast that struck Kanek square in the chest. The general staggered, his armor smoking, but he didn't fall. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice filled with venom. Ethan grabbed Lyra's hand, pulling her toward the exit. "It is for now." They sprinted back to the escape pod, the ship shaking violently as the core reached critical mass. As they launched away, the flagship erupted in a blinding explosion, the shockwave rippling through space. Ethan and Lyra watched in silence as the remnants of Kanek's empire burned in the void. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. Together, they had survived the impossible. And together, they would face whatever came next. A new beginning. The explosion of Kanek's flagship lit up the void like a second sun, its fiery tendrils spreading out into the cold expanse of space. Ethan and Lyra's escape pod drifted silently among the debris, the aftermath of the battle casting an eerie stillness. For a moment, neither of them spoke, both staring out of the viewport at the wreckage of the empire they had just destroyed. Ethan broke the silence first, his voice low. "It's over." Lyra, seated next to him, shook her head. "For now," she replied. "Kanek may be gone, but the Krellick Empire isn't. They'll regroup, and when they do, they'll come for us." Ethan leaned back in his seat, exhaustion finally catching up with him. "Let them. We've taken down their best. The rest can't be worse." Lyra gave him a faint smile, but her glowing blue eyes betrayed a hint of doubt. "You don't know the Krellick like I do. Their strength isn't just in their soldiers or technology. It's in their unity. Losing Kanek will only make them more dangerous. Someone else will rise to take his place." Ethan rubbed his temples, the weight of their victory already turning into the weight of their next battle. "Then we'll be ready." The pod's navigation system beeped, indicating a nearby human outpost on the edge of Krellick-controlled space. Ethan set the course, knowing they needed time to regroup and figure out their next move. As the pod accelerated toward the outpost, Lyra turned to him, her expression serious. "There's something we need to discuss," she said. Ethan glanced at her, sensing the gravity in her tone. "What is it?" Lyra hesitated, her hands resting on her lap. "The child," she said softly. "Our child. Its existence changes everything." Ethan blinked, the reality of her words hitting him again. In the chaos of the battle, he had barely had time to process the revelation. Now, with the silence of space around them, it was impossible to ignore. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cautious. Lyra's gaze dropped to her hands. Konech's experiments were about creating a bridge between our species, a hybrid that could unite humans and Krellick under his control. But this child wasn't created in a lab. It wasn't part of his plan. "It's unique." Ethan frowned. "Unique how?" Lyra looked up at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "I don't know yet, but I can feel it. The psychic connection I used to disrupt Konech's forces, it's stronger now, and it's centered on the child." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So you're saying the Krellick will come after us not just for you, but for the child?" Lyra nodded. "If they find out, they won't stop. They'll see the child as the key to their survival, or their domination." Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Then we don't let them find out. We protect it, no matter what."